Good evening. I'm Erica George, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center and Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. The University of Utah is situated in Salt Lake City on the unceded ancestral lands of the Goshute, Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. It is my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here this evening for our Author Meets Reader event, co-hosted with our partners at the King's English Bookshop. Tonight's event is also part of the 24th Annual Utah Humanities Book Festival. For more information about the book festival and the complete program, go to utahhumanities.org. We are also gathered here during Banned Books Week. The American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom has tracked 156 challenges to library, school, and university materials and services in the past year. This annual Banned Books Week celebration is a national celebration of the freedom to read, and it brings together the entire book community: librarians, booksellers, publishers, journalists, teachers, and readers of all types, in shared support of the freedom to seek and to express ideas, even when those ideas are considered unorthodox or perhaps unpopular. This is a community our author has dedicated this evening's book to. Books unite us, censorship divides us, is the theme for this year's annual Banned Books Week. Our Author Meets Reader series is a public outreach program that connects humanities scholars and writers with lifelong readers and learners. The series provides insight into the research and writing process, and it highlights the impact of humanities scholarship on culture and society. So we are delighted to be here with you at this time. To learn more about the Tanner Humanities Center and our upcoming programs, see thc.utah.edu and join our email list or follow us on social media. Named for Obert C. and Grace A. Tanner, the Tanner Humanities Center aims to advance humanities exploration and engagement through academic research, educational enrichment, and public outreach. Before we begin, it's my privilege to also thank the organizations and individuals who've made this evening's event possible. First, our partners at the King's English Bookshop, under the longtime leadership of Betsy Burton, whom I'll have the pleasure of introducing to you a bit later. And especially our funders, O.C. Tanner, the College of Humanities, the Sorensen Legacy Foundation, the Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Program, and Utah Humanities, which empowers groups and individuals to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. The Tanner Humanities Center staff, Beth James, Jeremy Rosen, Susan Anderson, Katie Pula, and our student staff, Hannah Taub, our Environmental Humanities Fellow, and Marika O'Sullivan, our undergraduate intern. We are also indebted to our friends at the King's English, especially Rod Ekman, the marketing manager, and Betsy Burton, co-owner, co-founder. Betsy Burton. Salt Lake City residents who love reading, those who love to write, anyone who appreciates good books and recognizes the talent required to create them. All of us owe a debt to Betsy Burton for enriching our lives. Betsy is the founder of the King's English Bookshop in Salt Lake City's 15th and 15th Neighborhood Business District, and she's made a living matching books to readers. And tonight is no exception. In fact, we are here tonight because of Betsy. I've been a longtime fan of the King's English Bookshop, and I've had the pleasure more recently of getting to know Betsy as a longstanding member of the Tanner Humanities Center board. She has kept us inspired over the years with incredible speaker suggestions, and she's helped us connect with outstanding writers, including Tony Kirshner, Zadie Smith, Michael Chabon, Margaret Atwood, and Suzanne Laurie Parks. Tonight is no exception. I expect tonight will be exceptional. We have her to thank for having Anthony Doerr here this evening. I give you Betsy to introduce her friend, this evening's guest.
Yay! Yay!
Great job, Erica.
Thank you all for coming tonight. to hear from one of our at the King's English, all-time favorite, from the very beginning authors, Anthony Doerr, discussing the book that we've all been waiting for, Cuckoo Land. On behalf of, now, Erica's a little bit behind because actually I just retired last week. So on behalf of Calvin Crosby, the new me, the new majority owner of our store, his partner, Ann Holman, and all of the wonderful booksellers at the King's English, as well as the Tanner Humanities Center, because we co-sponsor this event, I'd like to welcome you all, and please give a big welcome to Anthony Doerr. Anthony Doerr is and has been beloved by the King's English since the publication of his first book, the short story collection, The Shell Collector, and if you haven't read it, do. And then his two novels about Grace and the Pulitzer Prize winning All the Light We Cannot See, which our entire staff was gaga over, and still is, as well as Memory Wall, another wondrous collection of stories, and the vivid, often funny memoir, 4 Seasons in Rome, about the relentlessness of infant twins and the dazzle of culture and history that is Rome. He just told me they're 17 now. He has won, aside from the Pulitzer, the Rome Prize, the Carnegie Award, and the Alex Award, among others. Just one more minute. A finalist for the National Book Award in 2014, he was just longlisted for that same award this year. He lives with his wife and 2 sons, no longer infants, in Boise, Idaho. Tonight we're going to jump right into questions. At the end, we'll leave time for questions from the audience, but due to COVID, it isn't possible to have a book signing. But we do have pre-signed copies, and you'll all get yours at the doors as you leave. So, here then, my first question.
Okay.
All that.
Well, first, hi, everybody. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Betsy. This is the most people I've been around in a long time.
Me
I
too.
did it last night in Seattle, so the second most people, maybe. But it's okay if you freak out and need to leave. But I think it's good, right? It's going to be great.
Great.
Yeah, it's so fun to be around other human beings.
I know, I feel like I'm out of jail.
Like, if we were doing this on a Zoom webinar right now, it'd be like, I think that was funny, but then you watch the number, and you're like, oh, 2 people logged off. It's not going well.
Not so good. Okay, so although they grow and change over time, the characters whose stories you tell in Cuckoo Land are all children, at least initially. The children in All the Light We Cannot See remain luminous in my mind after all of these years. And I read this manuscript long enough back, several months ago, that I already know this is true. I can see all of them in my mind's eye now. But before we get into what each of them is doing in terms of the kind of the sweep of your novel, I wanted to ask you why you chose to approach a story that sweeps across not only history, but also the length and breadth of Western literature through the lives and inner worlds of these astonishing children.
Okay, thanks, Betsy. Okay, here we go. We have an hour, right? So I'm
We've
just going to
got
start.
a long time.
So this thing on the cover, you'll see there's a book inside of a book. So they're at least trying to give you a visual sense that this is a story about readers and the transmission of books through time. You mentioned us being in Rome when my wife was having a C-section. Twins came out of her body. And she was on morphine. I go back, it was an emergency C-section. I go back to our apartment. We had a 1-year job in Princeton, New Jersey. From Idaho, that enough was a big enough change for us. I go back and get her bag, and I check the mail at our rental apartment, and in it is a letter from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I've only published 1 book to this point, and they're offering us a year in Rome, all expenses paid. You get a little stipend, but we would have to leave in 3 months. So I go back to the hospital, I'm like, oh, hi. Hey, how are you feeling? So we had this extraordinary opportunity. My wife is amazing in every way, but the courage she had to just say yes. You know, those were our first and only kids. We had no idea what we're doing. And her parents live in Boise, so we had a little bench to call in when we were exhausted the first couple of months after we left Princeton. We go home with the babies, and then we fly to Rome, and they're 3 months old. And we lived there for a year. And that year, I'm learning, really, you know, there's a lot of classical scholars there, people who can actually read Latin and ancient Greek and, like, make sense of all these plaques and tombstones around Rome. And, you know, also landscape architects, so many interesting people. But I'm learning that year really impacted my work for a long time. I was supposed to be working on All the Light. That was 2014. That book, that was 2004. That book came out in 2014, 10 years later. I was supposed to be, like, finishing the novel while I was there. But I was just so enraptured by the city. You know, usually I start my day by writing a little bit in a journal or reading a couple poems, and then I start writing. And that usually the journal would kind of overtake my writing day. There's so much you learn about the city, and there's so many layers of history there. And so often the journal was my whole day. Plus, I was sleeping like an hour and a half a night. So my writing was awful at the same time. But while I was there, I guess the way I can begin to start to tell the story is there's two entrances. One, when you're young, you kind of think all the books that have survived from the ancient world are all the books that were written in the ancient world. And it wasn't, of course, I'm so ignorant, it wasn't until I was there in my 30s that I realized, oh, like 99.9% of the books that were ever been written down are lost. And we have just a tiny fraction of manuscripts that have tumbled down through the centuries and survived tyrants with armies and survived fires and floods and earthquakes and worms and beetles, and there's even acid inside ink and paper that destroys manuscripts. So memory is always being removed from the world. And you know, writing is a way to outlast death, and the codex is this amazing technology that allows you to outlast death in some ways, but still, books die too, and it takes stewards to keep them going. So that was one entrance, just kind of percolating in the back of my mind, like, oh, lost books, that's interesting to me. Somehow, the way, you know, young people who die in war, or really any young death, their potential shines so brightly in your mind because of what they could have become. Yeah, what might have been. There's something about that with lost books for me, too. Sometimes a found book, like when they dig out a manuscript in some garbage dump in Egypt, you're like, oh, that's not as good as I was hoping it was going to be. But yeah, like Sappho, the amazing lyric poet, this is like 600 BC, Sappho's writing. We think she wrote about 10,000 lines of poetry. We have 650. Aeschylus wrote, I think, about 90 tragedies. We have 7. Sophocles wrote about, we think, 110 plays. We have 7. So it's amazing. You think you know anything about ancient literature, but really you're just studying like a tiny corner of a tablecloth and making assumptions about the rest of the whole canvas. Anyway, that was one entrance. Here we go. I still haven't even got the kids. That was one entrance in the story. And the other was this landscape architect, this crazy guy named John Piasecki, who's working there, and his project was to study walls. And he talked about walls in such interesting ways. He talked about them as a technology, which I'd never heard of. And he talked about them as kind of sacred boundaries between, of course, us and them, but between alien, barbarian, you know, there's some kind of probably implicit racism involved in that, and like godlessness, and then culture and safety. And I started just getting really interested in walls. I'm writing a book, All the Light We Cannot See, is set, maybe 60% of it's set in a town called Saint-Malo in Brittany, France, which has a medieval wall around it. And I fell in love with that place and decided to set a book there by walking along the ramparts, about 2 kilometers of walls around the old city, which, of course, were obsolete by the time the Second World War comes around because airplanes just remove walls from the equation. But for centuries, walls were these really powerful and really preeminent defensive technologies in the world. And they divided sacred spaces from unsacred, kind of. So I just started thinking about those. And anyway, Saint-Malo was part of Hitler's megalomaniacal Atlantic Wall, which maybe many of you have heard of, this series of fortifications he was trying to build. There's like, I have some stats if you want to nerd out, but there's like millions and millions of tons of concrete, basically slave labor building these things. Like all megalomaniacal freaks, he was trying to build this incredible barrier to protect himself, basically. And Saint-Malo is a tiny portion of that. Every text I would read that talked about the history of the Atlantic Wall and the history of walls would mention Constantinople. I knew nothing about Constantinople. I was like, that's Istanbul, right? Question mark? Like, I didn't even know that. Because my high school education was basically we'd get through, we'd get a little of the fall of Rome, and then the teacher would like take a sip of water, and then you're in the Renaissance. And, you know, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Nothing happened for 1,100 years. Right. And so I love to use my work. I mean, I'm going to die ignorant about a million things, but I love to use my work to try to rectify a few of those ignorances before I die. And so I was like, okay, I think there's something here. And so all I did while I was trying to finish all the light, which took me way longer than I thought it would, was I just printed off a black and white etching from 1493, I think, from a Dutch book of the walls of Constantinople, and just taped it beside my desk as kind of a reminder that this is some curiosity that I want to chase when I get some time. But it wasn't until 2014. Now, the book comes out 2014, and I start noodling around with it. In 2015, there's an American presidential candidate going around the country meeting crowds in chants of build that wall. So there's walls are in the air, and I'm just thinking more about them. And then there's so many interesting popular historians now that love to kind of hate on farming. That's the downfall of humanity, which is the time. So let's say, okay, we have time, right? You guys with me so far? Okay. 15,000 years ago-ish, the Ice Age ends, and the area between the Nile and the Tigris rivers becomes super abundantly fertile. And so the argument is suddenly it's very easy to settle down. Like it's 70 degrees every day. It's super easy to grow the stuff you love to eat. And you're like, why am I going to keep foraging? I could just sit around. That sounds pretty good. But then along with settling down suddenly maybe the patriarchy develops. We can really get into that. But also this idea of inheritance. Like I'm going to gather up some property and then I'm going to pass it down to my kids. So maybe inequality is born at the same time that's showing up, and walls are showing up. And what's pretty interesting in this argument, which don't know enough about to make a powerful argument, but showing up around the same time are skeletons with wounds, like physical wounds. So maybe war is showing up around the same time. With war comes slavery. We can get into that too, though I'm not by any means an expert. So walls represent all kinds of changes to what happens with our species when we stop moving around with the seasons and start settling down. So I've got all this in my head, and I'm like, how am I going to begin a story about this? It's not until the walls of Constantinople, first of all. Are we doing okay? Did I erase all of your questions? Okay.
Half of them, but that's okay.
Yeah, you could rip them up. Walls of Constantinople were probably, I'm not an expert, probably the preeminent technology, defensive technology in the medieval world. They were triple walls, so imagine you're just a 5'10" person, 5'6" person, and first there's an enormous moat that's in most places 30 feet deep and 60 feet across. So you have to get across that. Then there's what's called a killing field. Then there's an outer wall, which was, I'm going to get all this stuff right in Utah, unlike last night where I was totally just making up my stats. The land walls are 5.7 kilometers. The inner wall is 12 meters high and 6 meters thick in places in the outer wall. So first you get across the moat, fine. You have like 20 crossbow bolts stuck in you. Then you get to the outer wall. It's 2 meters thick and 9 meters high. So that's like what? That's incredible. That's like 30 feet high. 30 feet high, you have to get over that. There's a battlemented walkway. You got to get over that. Then you get to this thing called a no man's land. And then there's this inner wall 12 meters high. And you got to get through that. So you can't. Nobody can get through it. 23 sieges over 1,100 years fail. People show up like on elephants. There's this guy, Crum the Bulgar, who's drinking like wine out of human skulls. And he's like, I'll get you, Byzantium. But he can't get through. And so insane wealth accumulates inside of this city. The best example I can give you is that in the Hagia Sophia, in the vaulting in the ceiling, at one point there's 4 acres of gold vaulting in the ceiling. So when travelers come to this place, they're like, oh my, I didn't know humans could do this kind of stuff. Maybe, who knows, but maybe the highest concentration of wealth the world has seen to that point. Among the treasures and the bad things and good things that are happening inside of the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, what we call Constantinople, books are also being preserved. About 75% of the ancient Greek texts that have survived to this day, so you can go to the University of Utah library and hold, say, texts by Plato. Those 75% of those texts survive because of Byzantine copies, copied inside libraries in Constantinople every, say, 100 years, although I'm totally making that up. Who knows how often they were copied and recopied by hand. We're learning sometimes by women, but often by monks. And it's just so interesting what choices are made to preserve what text and what kind of power decisions are being made there, and probably patriarchal decisions. How many women were erased from that record? How many maybe zealots got some power and were like, let's not recopy that book. Also, parchment was really valuable, and so sometimes you'd scrape it just because you're like, today I got to teach my class of my 5 bored monks, and we don't have enough parchment. So scrape off that last copy of Aristotle's thing on comedy, and let's recopy this passage from the Bible or something. So, there's so many whims to why something survives and doesn't survive. I still haven't got to kids. You want? Okay,
But
go ahead.
You're getting there, I can tell. I know the kid, too.
Yeah.
Kids.
Flannery O'Connor said to ask her how she writes, what did she say? Something like, to ask me about how I write is about trying to ask a fish how it swims, to describe how it swims. And so I'm a little worried about analyzing too closely why in the past 2 books, and in a little bit of Memory Wall too, I had a lot of young characters. But I think it's because I'm entering middle age. Like I have to do this half the time now. To read books, I have to wear these things. And habit is amazing. Habit helps you find the bathroom in the dark tonight when you have to pee. And it helps you cook an omelet in your kitchen because you know where the spatula is and you know how hot your burner gets. And it helps you find the Tanner Center of Humanities, did I get that right? Because you know how to get there, although maybe you didn't, and you had to kind of challenge your habits. There's an old proverb that says, habits are cobwebs at first, cables at last.
I like that.
And I think about them in terms of art making a lot. I think when you're composing a sentence, often you reach for a word that other people have used a lot before and used successfully. And so it loses a little bit of its power because of habits. For example, if I'm looking at like this gorgeous September sun that's just going down, like if I'm looking at that hitting water, I might say the sun glinted on the water. And I'm being too lazy, this is like what Zadie Smith says in this amazing essay, Fail Better. I'm being too lazy to separate glint from its old friend sun. Does that make sense? I'm just using habit. And I like to try to think in my sentences and also maybe in my life, I'm trying to break those scales that form over our eyes as we get older. There's lots of times when I rent an office outside my house, and there's lots of times when I don't even really remember my commute to work because I'm thinking about other stuff. But I'm so sad about that sometimes. We're gonna live, if we're so lucky, to 80 or 75. A bookseller in Sandy. Right. But it means you're lucky and you're taking good care of yourself.
Yeah.
There's a bookseller in Sandy, Utah, who had a heart attack last week.
I know.
55 or something. And so I'm just trying to think, I don't want to sleepwalk through my life. I want to learn as much as I can and see what I can while I'm still here. And so I'm trying to use art as a way to kind of slip your fingernails under the surface of life and see it each day, to see the world worlding all around us, as Heidegger said. So I think child characters maybe are helping me do that, because when my kids were like 8, I'd be like, you want to go to the grocery store? They're like, yeah, the grocery store. Like, you want the fire engine cart? They're like, totally, we want that. Dad, Cheez-Its. Like, I want Cheez-Its. I'm like, Cheez-Its are great, let's get Cheez-Its, Now I'm like, you want to go to the grocery store? They're like, oh, no, Dad, please close the door. think, that, I mean, so every book is a coming-of-age story in some ways, but, so many writers before me have done it as well. It's just a way to say, look at the world as new again. And maybe it ties in with a lot of the project of Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is to say, we're just one link. Like, we're just one little filament of a web in this vast, fascinating experiment that our species is undertaking on this planet. And so reminding myself that I'm not super important is kind of a project of decentering in a way. And so maybe that's why I'm choosing kid characters.
Well, they work very well, I might say. Okay, so this is sort of another part of the book. There's a story contained in an ancient Greek manuscript, as well as the folios in which they are written, which really, they bind the book together. And because I took Greek, I didn't take Greek, but I took Greek in translation 50 years ago in college, I knew about Aristophanes, and I knew even about Cloud Cuckoo Land.
Oh, right.
But
nobody else here did, though, I'm guessing.
Well, I'm sure many of them did. But the only Diogenes I knew was the philosopher, and I just couldn't figure out what was fact and what was fiction. So I want to ask you, I know some of it is fact, and I know some of it's fiction, and I'd like to know which is which.
Yeah, good. But that's kind of my whole intent. Like, the book opens with this character entering a library who doesn't mean very well, but he's walking down the aisle between fiction and nonfiction. So I'm trying to say, like, to the reader, even though it's probably a really clumsy, lame metaphor, but I'm trying to say, like, hey, we're going to be playing around with fictionality the whole time here. Okay, so there is a text at the center of this novel that each of the 5 protagonists reads. At a certain point, the book falls into their lives when they need it most. Maybe that's too publisher tagline-y.
No, it's true.
And let me even back up before that. Okay, here we go. We'll have 2 questions tonight.
Okay, good. No, I've got one more that I have to ask you.
Okay.
3 would be okay.
When I started in 2014-15 reading about Constantinople, I had a story, or I was beginning a narrative about a girl named Anna who lives inside the walls of Constantinople, who works in an embroidery house as basically like an indentured servant. And the more I thought about primarily women who did this work, there are still incredible examples of Byzantine embroidery that survive to this day, usually in praise of God, ecclesiastical garments of some type, amazing things. But the more I started to try to imagine the lives of the primarily women who made these things, you think, oh my gosh, 6 days a week, there's not electric lighting here, and so, you're working with clumsy tools, and you're basically doing it until you're hunched and your eyes are failing, and that's your life, that's your trip on the planet. So I started to think about Anna, and the way I chafe at being told what to do, kind of that's what I place in her, and that the way I use stories to kind of slip the trap of my own life, that's what I placed in her. Usually with a character, I'll start with some vital interest or some sliver of me, and then you pour water on it and see what happens and change it from yourself. But that's how I start anyway. So she was chafing, she just was dreaming herself out beyond the city walls, which she had never left beyond. And that would be an unusual thing, especially for a girl to do. Girls were allowed to become literate for different centuries during Byzantium, but not in the later part of the empire when this novel starts, 1400s. I also had a character outside the walls named Omir, and as this army comes in to siege Constantinople in 1453, just like All the Light We Cannot See was kind of an exploration of a brand new technology, the radio, that could magically send voices through walls and disrupt power structures madly. Hundreds, well, no, not hundreds, but let's just say that Goebbels, you guys know who that was? Okay, second worst human ever, possibly, was brilliant at recognizing the power of technology of the radio. He made radios very inexpensive. He cut the price, once they came to power in 1933, he cut the price of radio by half. Plus, in Germany at that time, you kind of had to have a subscription to listen to radio, kind of like Spotify or something now, and he managed to vastly increase the categories of people who qualified for these subscriptions. His goal was to get a radio in the kitchen of every German citizen, and in many ways, this was a way to deprive millions of people of independent thought. And a lot of interesting parallels with disinformation, scary ones today. Anyway, I think the first, I'm going to get some of this stuff wrong, but like the first radio before they come to power, 75 Reichsmarks, and he makes this thing called the People's Receiver in 1933, and that's 35 Reichsmarks, and pretty soon, there's an article in the New York Times from like 1939 that there's already over 1 million new radios, these People's Receivers that Goebbels had gotten into these homes. So I started reading about that, and I thought, what a fascinating disruptive technology. I hope as readers read all the light, they think about what sort of changes to power structures and truth and fictionality came in then and came up now with this new technology that we're all grappling with as you watch your kids pound TikTok 18 hours a day. And so, in this case, gunpowder arrives in Europe around the same time as the printing press, 15th century, and suddenly the walls of Constantinople, which have stood for so long, aren't as powerful suddenly. And this very young, usually it's young people who recognize the power of technology, this very young sultan named Mehmet II recognizes like the power, the psychological power, forget about the physical power of gunpowder, and starts building these mega cannons. He hires this founder from Hungary named Orban. And so I imagine, I've read a bunch of these, there are a few chronicles of the description of how they founded these foundries where they make these cannons. So I have that in the book, and Omir is a part of that. And they use oxen to drag this incredibly heavy thing through the mud, 110 kilometers or so, through the mud, the spring mud. They have to build bridges. It's always destroying the wheels of the carts they put it on. Incredibly heavy. It can fire a 2,000-pound cannonball. And usually, not usually, but often the people firing this thing are badly injured. It's an incredibly dangerous thing to be doing. All I've got, okay, that's like 7 fractals down in your question. Now let's go back up. All I've got at this point is Anna inside the city looking for a story. She's, for reasons I'm not going to get into because it might be a spoiler, she's going through old libraries and finds an old book that might be the very last copy in the world. It's very humble looking and damaged. And then there's this boy outside the walls, and I decide she's going to save this book basically from oblivion. I'm like a year into the project, and I decide that the only way to properly dramatize the power of this little act of stewardship is to show the book arrive in after Anna is gone from the earth, right. To arrive in the hands of a reader later. So I'm like, oh boy, I'm going to try something crazy. So I'm like, what other period of history saw a technology come in and massively disrupt stuff? And then I go into my kids' bedrooms and they're like, get out. I'm like, I'm going to show this book land in the present. Yeah. And try to braid in. Around this same time, I read a book, maybe bought it at the King's Village, but maybe I bought it at Rediscovered Books in Boise, called The Great Derangement by an Indian writer named Amitav Ghosh. Is that probably butchered? G-H-O-S-H. And it, I think, was maybe a series of lectures written down about wondering why artists, and primarily literary artists, weren't grappling more in their work in 2016 with the existential threat of climate change. And it was kind of like a little bit of a call to arms. I'm like, oh, yeah. For 10 years, I wrote a column on science books for the Boston Globe, and I would write about them, but I'd get probably an average of 3.2 readers of each column that I wrote. And so I'm like, oh, yeah, maybe storytelling is a better, more effective way. In this series of essays, although it's really one big essay, he conjectures that maybe it's because novels don't usually encompass enough time to show enough change to tell properly a climate change story. And so I thought, well, here I'm about to try 500 years in this library thing I'm working on. So I'm like, why don't I try to braid it? If it's about the survival of one story of human culture, do you guys, you know what Price is Right is? You guys ever see the Plinko board on Price is Right where they like drop a chip down through these pegs? That's how I'm imagining text. Like there's all these hurdles, and you're like, I hope it lands in my slot, but it's like, oh, fire, oh, floods, like, oh, it's burned, it's banned books week, you know, it's like, oh, it burned. But, oh, it's like, oh, this one landed in my hands, you know, and that's kind of how the story I'm trying to tell. It's like a big Plinko board, this novel. And so I thought, if I'm trying to tell a story about the survival of a manuscript, why don't I braid in questions about the survival of the species at the same time? So what was the question? Diogenes.
Yeah, it's the ancient manuscript of what was real and what wasn't
Yes,
real. But I think I know.
Right. No, that's good. I'm sorry it's taken me so long.
No,
It's now 9:45.
we are not bored.
So I searched and searched and searched and had some lonesome nights trying to figure out what text Anna would save from Constantinople. And what I really wanted to do was invent a lost book. I thought about this guy. I thought about so many different things. I thought about, for example, Callimachus. Anybody heard of this? Callimachus. Who cares if you haven't? One of the first librarians at Alexandria, and maybe one of the first alphabetizers. That's kind of a good little piece of Jeopardy information you can store in there and throw away later. But he apparently wrote 800 volumes, and all we have left are like 6 hymns and a couple fragments of things he wrote. Like nothing left. I'm like, perfect. He was, I guess, really into shortness, epitomes, and he was like, made a rant against the Iliad or something like, I prefer brevity. So I'm like, well, that's not really going to work for me very much. But I thought about him for a while. I thought about maybe Aeschylus and trying to invent a lost play, but then I found Aristophanes. In high school, I had read the Odyssey and Oedipus Rex. That's it. I got no classical education. I'm just like starting from zero. And I had a lot of insecurity about that. It's like you get to graduate school and people are like, well, of course, and as Ovid says. And I'm like, Ovid. Like I was reading Stephen King. I'm like, oh yeah, Ovid, totally, of course. Yeah. Like Zeus says. Is Zeus a writer? So I decided to first try the tragedians, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, there's this hilarious, body, exuberant comic playwright named Aristophanes. So we really have the 3, Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus are like these 3 tragedians that got studied a lot, all white males, and there's all kinds of complications with even studying these guys. But their literature is pretty amazing, and it's some of these plays are so emotionally powerful. And they're still performed today, and a few of Aristophanes' plays are still performed too. And he was the comic. And there were other comics, but he was the most famous one. He was the LeBron of comic playwrights. And so I was like, I got to start reading these, and I read one called The Birds. The Birds is the original kind of buddy comedy. Like Will Ferrell would have starred in The Birds for sure. It's about 2 kind of doofuses who decide Athens has too many lawyers, basically, and they decide to leave Athens and build a better city in the sky. And you can already feel Aristophanes like, good luck with your better city, guys, right? Like all utopian narratives, the utopia doesn't quite work out. But with the help of the birds, they build a place. It's called Nephalokokuya, which translates now-ish. We called it Cuckoo Cloud Land for a couple centuries, I think, was how it's translated. But at least for a couple, now 150 years in English, it's been translated as Cloud Cuckoo Land. And it's a place halfway between the realm of heavens, where the gods live, and the realm of earth, where the humans live. And they thought, oh, we're going to intercept the messages between them, and we'll have all this power. And of course, then they start eating the birds, so the birds turn on them. And one tries to claim more power than the other. But every time I'd go downstairs, so my kids were 0 to 10 when I wrote All the Light We Cannot See, and they were 10 to 17 when I was writing Cloud Cuckoo Land. And every time I'd go downstairs and see what was on the TV, they're watching like another planet blow up, or another city is on fire, and there's superheroes like whisking around above the flames. I'm like, man, there's a lot of dystopia going down in your world. Then even the books they'd read, they're like, ooh, yeah, I want to read more about like the destruction of all things. And so I thought, why don't I start playing around with utopian questions? I just thought, what does that mean? And there's, of course, this huge gray acreage between utopian and dystopian narratives, but I thought it would be so interesting to explore utopias. And seemingly, and I haven't done any comprehensive study, but in seemingly every culture and almost every era, humans have told stories about traveling far to better places. And what does that mean about us? And what does that suggest? I just was fascinated by this. So I thought, okay, I'm going to invent a story called Cloud Cuckoo Land. Okay, one more bit of information. Hang in there. First I looked at the list of lost plays by Aristophanes. The titles are there's one called Old Age, there's one called The Storks, there's one called The Phoenician Women. I'm like, this is cool, I could invent one of these. But as you sit down, his work is so full of inside jokes that only Athenians would have understood, and that scholars today like bicker about these really esoteric questions of what certain jokes would have meant. And about 2 weeks into this, after trying to explain to my wife, I'm trying to write like a playwright who lived 2,400 years ago and make it funny and good, I just decided I didn't know 1/10 of 1% of what I needed to know to pretend to be Aristophanes. But then I learned that novels, what a lot of scholars call novels anyway, which basically just means a long prose tale, were written in the ancient world. Me either. There's a whole text I could show you. It's called Ancient Greek Novels. It's like super thick with all 5 surviving Greek. There's 1 in Latin and 5 in Greek that the whole text survives. For a long time, they were dismissed as inferior to classical poetry and classical drama, but now there's been new scholarship like in the 90s that suggests they're really intertextually interesting, they're self-referential, there's some metafictional plays. Sorry to use all these fancy literary words, don't worry. It just means that they're actually a little more sophisticated than just like a romance or an adventure story. And there's, of course, tons that have been lost. We know about 20 titles of books that have been lost. There was a novelist, an ancient novelist, who lived around 19 or 1800 years ago named Antonius Diogenes, same initials, so that was appealing to me. And I was like, and there was, okay, here's something that will give the writers in here hives. None of his texts, none of his books survived. There are a couple fragments dug out of these garbage dumps in Egypt where 99.9% of the stuff they find are like tax records and stuff. But once in a while they're like, this looks like it might be a poem. I think there's 4 or 5 fragments, I'm not quite sure, of Diogenes's. But there's not even full sentences, there's gaps in them. But there is a 9th century summary of this book called The Wonders Beyond Thule, Thule, that was basic. It was written by a patriarch in, you guessed it, Constantinople, in case you weren't guessing. And it's basically a book review that has outlasted the novel, which is terrifying. 900, well, maybe, yeah, that's 900 CE, so maybe 800 years after he writes the book. Somebody reads it, writes a review, the last copy of the book goes away like the passenger pigeon is the last one on earth, gone from the earth. But this book review still survives.
One of our blurbs.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's kind of amazing. It sounds like the book was pretty amazing. There's a bunch of interlocking narratives. I'm like, check, perfect. It's got a lot of playfulness with fictionality, what's true and what's not. He claims in the preface of the lost preface to the lost book that he discovered the whole text in a tomb marked, stranger, whoever you are, open this to learn what will amaze you. The reader knows, however, that this is invented. So there's a little playfulness there too, but he's pretending that he found this whole story in a tomb. And so he's kind of like, this is basically true, right, reader? The way all of us novelists do. We're all pretending that all these characters are real, even though we know it's just black marks on a white page, making kind of magic, right? It's interesting to me. So anyway, this was set in 24 books, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey were divided later by librarians into 24 books to match the number of letters in the Greek alphabet. The Wonders Beyond Thule, this lost novel, was also divided into 24 books. It involved a trip around the world and possibly was the first science fiction novel because it sounds like it also included a trip to the moon. I'm like, okay, I'm going to mess around with this. So I thought, I'm going to call something Cloud Cuckoo Land, and I'm going to invent 24 pieces of it. The whole thing isn't going to survive, but Anna's going to find this text, and then it's going to ricochet down through the pegs of the Plinko board into the present and land in the hands of these readers. What I invent is a pretty silly story, kind of loosely based on this old Latin story called The Golden Ass, where a guy accidentally turns himself into a donkey when he's trying to turn himself into a bird. And so I invent...
It's a great story.
Yeah, it's really silly. And bawdy and... So in my case, this guy who's longing, he sees Aristophanes' play The Birds. He's drunk, so he mistakes Cuckoo Land for a real place. He's like, I'm going to get there. So he travels to this place Thessaly, where magic happens, and tries to turn himself into a bird to fly there, but he gets turned into a donkey instead, and many adventures ensue. I needed a story that would appeal to kids, because each of these characters were kids. So interspersed in the novel are 24 little folios, which are just fancy words for pages, basically. And they're just little snippets of this story that you can read along the way, and you'll learn later who translated it, and you'll learn a little bit more as the novel goes on about why each one is placed where it is in the 24 books of my novel.
Okay,
So Diogenes was real, the book's not real.
the book's not. I've got it. Okay, we're gonna kind of flip forward here a little. I'm not going to turn this into a question, but I just want to say before I go to a question that story is absolutely at the core of this book, and over again, you use a phrase that you just used, slip the trap. And I just want everybody to know that one of the amazing things about this book is that there are all these characters. And oftentimes in a book with a lot of characters, you're going back and forth and, oh, damn, I want to read about this one. Do I have to go there? This one, I don't know how you did this, but this one, you care so profoundly for each of the characters by the time you're not very far in that you're okay to make the change, to switch, because you want to know as badly about the character that you left a few pages ago as you do the one you're reading right now, and so you just keep going on and slip the trap. You just lose yourself in the book. And I had that turned into a fancy question, but I just needed to tell people that.
Oh, thanks. Well, I'm going to turn it into a fancy question, because last night I read this quote from James Baldwin. It's so cool. For me, forget about my dumb books. Like, reading slipping the trap just means like you slip outside the confines of your own skull. And that's what reading has allowed me to do my whole life. I think my life would be so much poorer if I didn't get to live in like these multiple streams and leave not the trap necessarily, but the prison of my own head in a sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, here's James Baldwin says it's so great. This is an essay in Life magazine, 1963. It's really short. You think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me the most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. And I think that's it for me. That's the thing. It's like all the people who have been alive. The fact that in books you can recognize like, oh, Anne Frank felt some of the things I feel, and she's been wiped off the face of the earth. It just makes you feel less alone and more profoundly connected to the people around you and the people who hopefully will come after you and live before you too. So that's what slipping the trap means to me.
Okay, so this fits actually right into, this is my final question. We just skipped about 7 here. Okay, your books pull on many threads evoking The Name of the Rose, Stranger in a Strange Land, The Birds, The Outsider, The Odyssey, The Iliad, Catch-22, A Fine Balance. It's fable and romance and Greek drama, magic and mystery, science fiction, and God knows literary fiction all at once. Anna, when in the monastery library, is told something that led me to wonder about this. Would you mind reading 2 pages? For you, it's when the scribe is describing for Anna what the Count of Urbino wants to acquire for his library. And here are...
Okay, thanks, Betsy.
Okay.
The scribe makes him sound so fancy that it's really just like a fence. He's like trying to maybe save books, but he's really just trying to make money. He's sending these kids into this old library to salvage stuff. He dreams, that's where you wanted me to start,
Yeah.
right, I think? Yeah. Okay, so this is a scribe telling these 2 kids why their master wants old books. Whoops. He dreams, says the first, of erecting a library to surpass the popes, a library to contain every text ever written, a library to last until the end of time, and his books will be free to anyone who can read them. Their eyes, this is now the scribes describing, their eyes glow like coals, their lips are stained with wine. They show her treasures that they have already procured for their master on their travels. A terracotta centaur made in the time of Isaac, an ink pot that they say was used by Marcus Aurelius, and a book from China they say was written not by a scribe with quill and ink, but by a carpenter, turning a wheel of movable bamboo blocks. And they say this machine can make 10 copies of a text in the time it takes a scribe to make one. It all leaves Anna breathless. All her life she has been led to believe that she is a child born at the end of things, the empire, the era, the reign of men on earth. But in the glow of the scribe's enthusiasm, she senses that in a city like Urbino, which is where they're from, beyond the horizon, other possibilities might exist. And in daydreams, she takes flight across the Aegean, ships and islands and storms passing far below, the wind streaming through her spread fingers, until she alights in a bright, clean palace full of justice and moderation, its rooms lined with books, free to anyone who can read them. I'm going to skip that little thing from the Odyssey because it'll confuse everybody. Okay. One night the scribes riffle through another sack of bloated, musty manuscripts and shake their heads. What we seek, says the smallest one, slurring his Greek, is nothing like these. Scattered among their parchment and penknives are plates of half-eaten turbot, that's a fish, and dried grapes. What our master seeks in particular are compendiums of marvels. We believe that the ancients traveled to distant places, all four corners of the world, lands known to them, but as yet unknown to us. Anna stands with her back to the fire and thinks of Licinius, this was her teacher, writing okeanos, which is the word for ocean, into the dust. Here are the known, here are the unknown. Out of the corner of her eye, she can see Himerius pilfering raisins. Our master, says the tall scribe, believes that somewhere, perhaps in this old city, slumbering beneath a ruin, is an account that contains the entire world. The mid-sized one nods, eyes shining, and the mysteries beyond. Himerius looks up, his mouth full. And if we were to find it, our master would be very pleased. Anna blinks. A book containing the entire world and the mysteries beyond? Such a book would be enormous. She'd never be able to carry it.
Or to write it. But in many ways, that's what you have done, written it. It has already sent the booksellers of America into raptures, reviewers too, because it's a book that allows us all to slip the trap, to lose ourselves utterly, but in doing so to travel the earth and cross centuries, to fall in love with mothers and their sons, owls and oxen, librarians and readers, and to witness the marvelous and the tragic, the wonders of history and of the human heart. It has everything anyone could ever want in a novel. How did you come to take on such a prodigious feat and to succeed so brilliantly? You don't have to answer the last part, but the first part.
Thanks, Bets. That's so nice. It's so gratifying. Well, I think, okay, I can tie this whole thing together. I'm going to try. When I was 13, maybe 14, my older brothers were already off in college, and so I was becoming an only child, and my mom's science teacher, she worked all the time, but my grandmother was diagnosed with something called Alzheimer's disease. This is the mid to late 80s. I've never heard of this word. I don't know if my mom had either, but she was accidentally burning stuff and stuff, so grandma moves in with us. And of course, I'm too self-centered to really understand the pain my mom is going through. But over the next 2 years, I watched this disease eat everything that was my grandmother. Like our self depends on our being able to remember things. And so there were funny moments. She could beat me in gin rummy when she had no idea who I was. And Christmas was great because she would just she would open one gift over and over, like a shirt, I got this shirt. We're like, yep, you just got it, Grandma. But it was also just a profoundly sad time. I wasn't able to articulate any of that or have any tools to process any of that. And now I think in my 40s, I've learned that I'm obsessed with the fragility of memory, probably because of that experience. Yeah. And memory wall even, there's a lot about there's a character with Alzheimer's in the title novella of that book, and in some ways, even though the light struggles and tries to ask questions about that, like what stories are being told about the Second World War, and are they fair, and what light aren't we looking at when it comes to kids and war. So here I was trying to ask those questions quite a bit, I think. And I think I was trying such an ambitious project because I just feel all the time like I'm running out of time. If you really, I mean, I don't want to scare anybody, but if you really started like breaking down the math of how much time you have, like quit your job, go do stuff. Like there's not that much time, and it's okay to hang out and watch that new Korean show on Netflix that everybody's watching, my kids are watching, Squid something. But once in a while, just think like, oh man, like how many more autumns are you gonna get in the Wasatch Mountains where the aspens are veining everything with yellow and these clouds, and hopefully the smoke is gone and you get to go up and look at that stuff. And so I think what I was trying to do while I still have my intellect intact is to try something crazy. The last book reached a lot more readers, so I think my publisher was just going to be willing to try something. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to try to put all my preoccupations of the last 7 years into this book.
And he succeeds brilliantly. So we're going to open this up to questions from the audience in a minute, but before we do, this book is about libraries in a profound way. So I thought it appropriate to read a quote from a librarian. And, I wrote this long, rapturous blurb, we call them, of this book. Hers, I think, captures this book better than any other blurb that I've ever seen. So I'm going to read it. This is a novel that makes us feel the reach for our best selves, our aching and faltering but great capacity to love other people and owls and oxen in a world that is so wide and unwieldy and still full of wonders. We can go to the library, we can look at a page, we can imagine, we can feel ourselves part of a magic bigger than ourselves. That's his book. And now we've already taken up a whole hour, but we will take a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can repeat them into my mic too.
Okay. I have been lucky that I have been able to read this book. So I have a question. It's not exactly a question, maybe just a comment, but you have all these stories in this bigger story. But you have also intertwined false stories and how that affects Seymour.
Yep.
And I'd like you to comment on that.
Okay, yeah, that's going to be tricky without spoiling anything.
You have stories, and it's fabulous. I highly recommend it for that. But I'd like to hear what you would say about false.
Okay, of course. She was asking me about false stories inside the book, which is a kind of fun new way of talking about disinformation, basically. Yeah, the dark side of story, which is if you tell a really compelling story, you can get people emotionally engaged in something that maybe isn't necessarily true. And so, yeah, this is going to be a little tricky for folks who have no idea what I'm talking about, but there's a character named Seymour who lives in the present, and later in life he gets involved in I hope I don't spoil anything here, but he gets involved in a Google Earth-like project, which is trying, there's so many petabytes of data already in Google Earth, but the idea is soon they'll be able to map the Earth like down to the centimeter, which is terrifying, interesting and terrifying all at once. But how much do corporations really want to show everything that's around us in great detail? Is this helping answer your question? I see. The way Seymour gets radicalized. Yeah. Is that more you're thinking? Got it. Okay. That's much easier to do without. Yeah.
Trump age.
Yeah. Seymour is attached very much to the forest behind his home. I don't think that spoils anything. And development moves in. I'm sure many Salt Lake residents can relate, as we can in Boise. And a place that was really beautiful, profoundly important to him is removed from his life. And so As he becomes a teenager and starts educating himself about deforestation and climate change and the loss of species, the biodiversity crisis, which is an under-talked about crisis on our planet. Enormous quantity of wild animals have been removed from the planet in my lifetime. He falls in on the internet with watching videos of a guy who radicalizes him and asks kind of, I hope, complicated questions about the calculus of human survival, which is like if you kill a few people now and you stop the machine of the destruction of the earth, maybe there might be value in how many lives you could save later. I don't necessarily agree with Seymour and this leader on that stuff, but he falls into this narrative. That's about as far as I can go, I think. But yeah, reading a lot about, say, the radicalization of young people by, say, Islamic extremist groups, for example. But not to pick on them, there's lots and lots of radicalization happening in all kinds of different ways because you can enter these little honeycombs on the internet and reinforce your own beliefs, as everybody here knows as well as me. That seems really sad to talk about. Yeah. Yeah, good question. She was asking me about doubt. I assume there is some doubt. Every day, every minute of my life. As Betsy's reading that quote from Jenny Davidson, the librarian, all I'm like is like, well, Jenny's wrong. Most people are going to hate it.
He's wrong, they're not.
It's just always present. And I hope I can reassure you that the older artists I meet have it too, and it just never goes away. Like my editor says, oh, Don DeLillo still gets really bummed out at a bad review. And you're like, oh, what? Like, that's impossible. But it's reassuring, I think. And so you have to, every day, if you want to be a quilter, if you want to make rock operas, if you want to be a writer, if you want to just write one poem for your parents' anniversary, there's going to be doubt, and you're going to have to work through it. If you're Erica and you just have to introduce people and stand up, you're going to doubt yourself. It's human. And so every day you find little tricks. Mine is a drug called caffeine, and that usually helps. Sometimes it accelerates the doubt, but sometimes it works really well. And you just fight through it. But then the doubt comes at night. You wake up and you're like, oh, multiple centuries? Like, that's crazy. Nobody's going to be able to keep all these characters straight. I'm trying to spin 5 plates in the reader's head and keep all 5 spinning.
It's amazing.
And you're like, one's going to crash for sure. The great power against doubt is sleep-in time and practice, I think. Just like any practice, let's say you want to be fit, you have to kind of do it every day or every other day. And that's kind of the same thing, I think, with art making. You just say, if I'm there, there's going to be days when you're full of negative, sad, tough feelings, and you don't make much progress. But if you're there and you show up, the people around you will kind of respect your effort too, and that's really important. And you'll begin to respect your effort too. So then there are these bright, sunny days where you're like, I think I've got something. I think I caught a little bit of electricity here. And that doesn't mean the next day you won't reread it and doubt it again. And finding those friends who can be honest with you but support you, or one partner, one spouse, one writing group, one poetry group, one professor, that's the kind of the way to just keep going. But of course, doubt is human. Hi. Great. Anybody hear that? She's smarter than me, but basically it was about like Anna in that little tiny section. And a lot of what she's going through is dealing with feeling like she's living at the end of things. And what I learned and continue to learn when you think about, say, the Cold War and my parents or maybe my grandparents in some ways growing up in those eras, they're like, the world's going to end any minute. And the people inside Constantinople, particularly what we call Greeks, they thought of themselves as Romans, inside Constantinople with the Ottomans at the gates, and they finally believe the city's going to fall. They are convinced that's it. Like, if the world is ending, this is the apocalypse, the Antichrist is at the gate. And it's just so interesting to me how many generations have felt that way, and yet the human species persists, and culture keeps going, and we keep telling stories. So yes, there are tons of existential threats that we're all facing, and I hope that you can find some, the way past anxiety, the way past depression is connection. And finding that during the pandemic is brutal. Like, a severed life is an impoverished life. And technology is severing us all the time. Convenience severs us from a lot of things. It's really cool to be able to just, whatever. Rob was talking about microwave an enchilada, like, boop, I just made an enchilada. Whereas when I was a kid, I'm like, let's preheat the oven. Like, well, it's still at 210. You know, but convenience robs you of some connection in life. The easy example is meat. Like, if you go buy chicken breasts at the store, you don't get any blood and feathers all over you. You just get these cool little chicken breasts. You never even get to know the chicken. And then you just like cook the chicken and you eat it, and you're not connected to it the way our ancestors evolved to be connected to it. And that's just one instance. When your apartment is hot 3 days ago and you're like, let's cool it down. Boop, you turn this thing and you're like, cool, I got cool air. We aren't faced with all the complicated infrastructure that delivers the energy to cool off the air in our apartment. And that's brand new. That's a brand new thing for humans to confront, another severing. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to seek out more connection than ever, because we're often being siloed and disconnected. And for me, there's a million ways to do that. You can volunteer at the library. You can deliver books for King's English. You can, what is your son also doing? He's delivering meals, right?
For Utah Food Bank, yeah.
Yeah, for the food bank. But one thing, ironically, because you do it alone, that has provided me a sense of imaginative connection to other people is reading. I think the literary arts in particular remind you of how many, at the micro level, like a simile is a little act, a tiniest thread, a filament of connection. It's connecting you to an image that you don't think is connected, and then it is, and you're like some genius simile writer like Rachel Cusk or something. She can just make this simile, and there's two images that you're like, a bus isn't like a banana or something, but then it is. With her language, it is. And that's kind of at a larger level what fiction is doing too, or poems. They connect you to somebody else. And so the more you can remind yourself of those connections and actively work on that, where you put your attention is where you're going to put your life. And you know, we talk about like attention is a commodity or something, but your attention's always there except for when you're asleep, and it's up to you. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't scroll through your phone every once in a while and stuff, but especially now, hopefully as the masks are starting to come off, you can go just say like, hey, what's up to your neighbor. And so that's at least my recipe or my hope to try to keep fighting despair, keep working at that level.
And one thing about this book is that's so comforting, and I think part of the comfort comes from us being disconnected in the pandemic, is all the connections you make. I mean, the connections across centuries and generations, and these kids, most of them don't even speak the same languages, but there's translation. The interconnection is part of the great comfort of the book you've written.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, I tried to build it at all kinds of different levels,
Yeah,
the way these characters feel some kind of connection. And that's why I kind of shattered each of their narratives and then pieced them together in this mosaic, so that you as a reader are actively drawing connections with your imagination between each of them.
Yeah.
I'm obviously not remotely the first person to try to do that, but these constellations, the way like Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street is a constellation of little prose poems, or I love this book called Platero y Yo. In Spanish, it's 1916. His name was Jimenez, and it's about a donkey and a man, but it's built of these glittering little prose poems almost. This donkey and this guy moving through the Andalusian countryside. But each one is pretty in its own right, but the
Yeah.
connections your mind draws between them when you move between these little seemingly unrelated but related sections, something really profoundly pretty about that and pleasing to humans. Comforting, yeah, that's a good word. Okay, yeah, should we let people go soon? Okay, maybe our last question? Okay. Yes, she's asking me about what's coming up next. I usually don't say any, I have some ideas, yes, but I usually don't say anything because they're like these fragile little like seedlings. And I literally, like if I said it right now and I just felt the energy in the room, be like, that sounds boring. I would just be crushed and I would stop immediately. So I'm just like, I'm not gonna say anything for a while, because I think I have 3, and then you just pour water on them each day if you can, and then you see which ones grow a little stronger. Thank you guys so much for coming out.
Thank you so much.